In this video, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. I know that many of you have all sorts of questions about the channel, how I became interested in international relations, as well as specific questions relating to the cases I have and haven't yet covered. I therefore thought that it might be interesting if I did a question and answer session. So here goes. Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking. For anyone new to the channel, my name is James Ker-Lindsay, and here I cover issues to do with international relations, independence, statehood, and the origins of countries. So the first question comes from Simon S. How did you become interested in this field? Well, I'd always been interested in politics, but I think my real interest in international relations really first emerged when I was about 18 or 19, and my family moved out to the island of Cyprus in the Mediterranean. And I was just fascinated in the politics of the island and the division. And so from there, I went on and did postgraduate studies. I did my master's and PhD in international conflict analysis, focusing very much on the Eastern Mediterranean and on the Cyprus issue. And it sort of really developed from there. I then became very interested in the Balkans, and must be about 16, 17 years ago, Kosovo was quite a big issue. And I found that there were really interesting parallels between Cyprus and Kosovo. So I started to write about that and just generally became fascinated in the question of statehood, recognition, secession. Why do some countries manage to make it as full members of the UN and others don't? What are those factors? So that's really what led me in the direction of looking at international relations. Second question comes from the remarkably named Awesome Boy. What are my most memorable memories? I've been really fortunate. I've had a fascinating career, and I've done lots of really interesting things over the course of my career. I think the things that really stand out to my mind are where I've taken my academic work and had a chance to put it into sort of more practical directions. So, for example, one of the first jobs I did when I left university, and I just got my PhD, was working on a project on Greek-Turkish relations. We had something called the Greek-Turkish Forum, which brought together a number of very high-level policy makers and influencers, if you like, in the non-social media term, in the traditional term. So senior journalists, business figures, former diplomats, former military officials, to talk about Greek-Turkish relations. And that was an incredible insight into practical peacemaking. And that's something that I've been really, really interested in throughout my career. So as well as writing on issues to do with conflict resolution, conflict management, I also have this background, if you like, in the practical element. And more recently, I think the real standout memory was when I worked on the Cyprus settlement talks in 2017. So I was part of the British Foreign Office for a year, and that was an absolutely incredible experience to be very, very closely involved in a UN process. Sadly, it didn't resolve the Cyprus issue for all sorts of reasons, but nevertheless, it was something that really does stand out and very memorable. And I think that's something that's been with me throughout all the work that I've done, which is trying to take my interest in the academic side of things and merge it with my interest in the practical side of things. So it's, if you like, having a foot in both camps. And that I think has produced my most memorable experiences. So, a great question from Geography World. Which separatist region deserves independence and recognition the most? This is obviously a really, really difficult question, because when you work a lot on these sorts of issues and you speak to people, you realize that there is this sort of fundamental need that many people have for their own sort of sense of identity, their own sense of country. And this is something I think is very natural. So to say that one deserves it more than another is very difficult. You understand that each group feels that they aren't being paid attention to, that they haven't got this right of independence and would like it. And so I think that that is, as I say, it's very difficult to say, well, one deserves it more than another. That said, I think that one group or one country that really does stand out to my mind is Somaliland. And I think I think there's a lot of reasons why I would say that. I think because there's a whole set of circumstances surrounding it. The fact that there is clearly a sense of identity there, but also that it was, albeit very briefly, an independent country in its own right before it merged with Italian Somaliland to form the Somali Republic. I think the utter chaos that we've seen in Somalia and the way that Somaliland has been, if you like, this oasis of stability and calm, and has effectively existed as an independent country for 30 years, despite all the instability that's taken place in Somalia, I think really does sort of make it stand out to my mind. And of course, this has been recognised by others. I mean, in my videos that I did on Somalia and Somaliland, I spoke about how the African Union had identified that this really was, if you like, a special case, and everything that I've seen does really make it stand out for me as a special case. And in many ways, I think that there is a sense that this could very well become a fully internationally recognised country and a member of the UN. But it takes one country to make that first step, one major country to recognise it. And I think we could start to see others follow. So while I'd say on the whole, I think that, there are a few that I'd pick out and say, look, this is more deserving of recognition and independence than other cases. I think Somaliland, for all sorts of reasons, really, really does stand out as a case of a country that has no recognition whatsoever and yet has a remarkably strong case to be a full member of the United Nations. Next question comes from Mateo Aguado. What do you think about independence movements in my country, Spain? Now, this is obviously extremely, when you start talking about independence movements, and this touches on the question that'll come later, one has to tread very, very carefully. I think rather than sort of specifically say, how do I feel about independence movements in Spain? One of the questions I often get asked is, how do I feel about independence movements in general? And it's a really, really complicated sort of thinking to unpack because there is so much there. So on the one hand, you've got this sort of sense that people should have a right to independence. But on the other hand, you also realise that there's a fundamental need for stability in the international system. And this is something that policymakers have really grappled with. And also a lot of us who not only do policy type work, but also are very interested in the academic side, think about this a lot. How do you take a case such as Catalonia, where there is a significant, though by no means from what we can see necessarily a majority view in favour of independence, that should have a right to express that view and should, in my view, have a right to vote on that, but at the same time understand that you just can't necessarily have an unfettered right of secession in international politics. There have got to be some rules. And that in many ways, the current system that exists at the moment, where a country can just simply say to a territory, to a people's, no, you're not even allowed to talk about this, is fundamentally unjust. How do you put those two positions together? In many ways, this is something that I really, really grapple with, and I think about a lot. I don't know if it necessarily comes out a lot on the channel, but it's a huge question. So I think I tend to take the view that we should be allowing peoples to have a right to have a say on their future, this idea of self-determination, and a right to independence if they so want it. But it has to be very, very carefully managed. And I think, we understand that they just can't be, you can't have groups unilaterally declaring independence all over the place. That would create a very, very chaotic situation. So this actually tackles a really, this goes to the heart of a very, very interesting question altogether. The next question comes from Christos Nicolaou. Do you think there are any benefits to devolution or asymmetric federalism? Now, this is a really, really interesting question. And Christos, I know is a Cypriot, exactly where you're coming from on this and what you're touching on. And so for others, this is really sort of talking about how do you deal with a situation where you essentially have two groups living within a state, one which is quite significantly larger population-wise than another. And when you create a federation, in some ways that might seem like a really sensible, logical thing to do. But it can create a lot of resentment if the larger group, so in this case of Cyprus, you'd essentially have the Greek Cypriots, which roughly speaking represents 80% of the population, and then the Turkish Cypriots 20%. If you give them absolute equality, that can often lead to a sense of resentment amongst the majority community. Why is it that, we're 4/5 of the population, they're 1/5, but their vote is just as equal to ours? So for every 4 Greek Cypriots, deciding on one thing, one Turkish Cypriot can decide on the other. And so what you have to do is think about how you're going to manage that. And it's incredibly difficult because on the other hand, if you create a system where you just do it strictly proportionally, then the smaller community just simply feels written out. The larger community, when you're 80%, will just control everything. So it becomes very, very difficult to find that very nice balance between creating that equality between the two communities, which means that one isn't written out of the equation, isn't downgraded, but at the same time finding a way that the majority can be recognised that they are far larger and that the smaller community can't necessarily veto everything that the larger community wants. And it's an incredibly, incredibly difficult question. And we struggle with it in peace processes. So a really, really interesting issue, and certainly something that I'd like to look at more. The next question comes from Ansi Rulamo. Do you see the Faroe Islands as a possible new independent state within the next 10 to 15 years? This is a really, really interesting case. So I just did that video on the 20 leading independence movements around the world, and I didn't include the Faroe Islands. It did go through my mind because I think this is one of the more serious, if you like, potential independence movements in Europe. And there are actually quite a lot of them of sort of different levels, if you like, of seriousness. Very, very difficult to say, but certainly, again, this is going to be one that I'd like to look at in more detail in the future videos. So I will come back to this one. Next, Sanchit Cabra. Which overseas territories will secede? Now, this is a really fascinating question as well, because actually it rather touches to quite a significant debate that exists within the community of people who look at secession. And it touches on the question of, is decolonisation secession? Now, I actually take the view that it isn't. I don't believe that the colonial powers have a right to these territories, and that it isn't that these territories are breaking away from the central country. The central, the metropolitan authority, if you like, in this case, the colonial power, let's call it what it is, exercises control over these territories. But I don't think that we should see them as part and parcel of that colonial state. So I've never viewed decolonisation as secession, but there is actually a body of opinion that does regard it as secession. And so this is actually a really, really interesting debate. So rather than tackle the question of which overseas territories will secede, I'm rather using this question to point out that by using the word secession with overseas territories, it rather actually raises this fascinating question about what exactly is secession, and is decolonisation secession? The next question comes from Nathan Frizek. And what is the most neutral way to talk about a blank without inferring anything about its recognition or status? This is a brilliant question, because this is something that all of us who work on de facto states, recognition, secession, really struggle with. It's an absolute minefield. to be talking about breakaway territories in language which is neutral, because it's so easy to put your foot wrong, and that you create all sorts of problems. And this, particularly for diplomats, is a hugely difficult area. They have to be so careful in what they say, because everyone's constantly looking out for, are they inferring some sort of recognition in what they say. And so what actually happens is that there is a so-called sort of, a vocabulary that you develop, which, to be fair, changes depending on the audience you're speaking to. And you do that just simply so you don't necessarily insult people unnecessarily. So, for example, in the Cyprus problem, Greek Cypriots will talk about the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, or the so-called Northern Cyprus, or the pseudo-state. I wouldn't use the word pseudo-state. I wouldn't actually use it at all. But I certainly wouldn't use it talking to a group of Turkish Cypriots. But on the other hand, I wouldn't be using the term Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, because this is a state that's not recognised. The UN has actually asked countries not to. So very often I'll put it in quotation marks, which is a standard way that it's usually dealt with. But I won't use something that's necessarily directly inflammatory to Turkish Cypriots, that negates the fact that they have their own self-proclaimed state. So what you do is you have to tread very, very carefully. You can accept the standard international terminology, if you like, in usual circumstances, but then adjust it slightly depending on your audience, so that you're not necessarily inflaming tensions or unnecessarily insulting anyone. Next question comes from JJ. Is breaking off relations with another state considered a removal of recognition, or is that only the case if there is an explicit statement to that effect? This is as well a brilliant question, because this actually opens up all sorts of confusion that exists about recognition. So there's actually a huge debate in international law about whether you can de-recognize a state. And many lawyers say that you can't de-recognize. I think you can, but only under specific circumstances. You can't de-recognize to nothing. So a country can't say to country X, can't say to country Y, we no longer recognize you. And more to the point, we don't recognize any sovereign authority over the territory of your state. So you can de-recognize, but only if you're recognizing someone else's authority over this. Now, the key question that this comes up for tends to be, well, there's a couple. Kosovo is one of them, because there's been all these issues of de-recognition. Now, you may remember that I actually touched on that in another video. But then there's also these questions about Israel and how that exists. And that actually touches on another really interesting point, which is something I haven't covered yet, which is the recognition of governments versus the recognition of states. So I tend to talk about state recognition, but there is also this principle of the recognition of governments. Tends not to be used a lot, but in recent years, I've got a sense that it's creeping back into the debate. And again, this is something I'll come back to, but this is a really, really interesting question about different forms of recognition. So one of the things that really stands out is that there was actually quite a lot of questions about unification and state mergers. So I've lumped together, if you like, 3 questions which have come up on this, which are all terribly interesting. So first of all, Fruela Asturianas, what do you think about Romanian Moldovan unification? This is such an interesting question, because it raises some really interesting practical issues if it were to go ahead. So I sort of briefly touched on this a little bit in the video that I did on independence movements when I talked about Transnistria and the separation between, or the coming together and then separation of Romania and Moldova into 2 different countries. And there has been talk about them coming together. Again, I'll come back to this in another video, but I think what really interests me in all of this is, of course, Romania is a member of the European Union. And so there is a real question about how would the mechanics of Moldova uniting with Romania operate in terms of entry into the European Union. Now, everyone would immediately say, oh, but it happened with East and West Germany. Yes, but it was a rather different case for all sorts of reasons. There was a sense that this was a historic destiny. It was at a different era. It's also 30 years ago. How would it happen now? So this is certainly something I'm really interested in, and I will tackle this in more detail because, as I say, it raises a fascinating question about the European Union as well. So the second question in this group comes from James Adams, who asks, what are the chances of South Cyprus unifying with Greece? This is a really interesting question because this is something that very often comes up, and people sort of seem to believe that there's still this movement for unification between Cyprus and Greece, which, as you remember, again, was something I tackled in one of my first videos about how Cyprus became independent and didn't unite with Greece. And I think the thing to say is that to my mind, it's really unlikely. In fact, it's next to impossible. There isn't a body of opinion in Cyprus anymore that stands in favour of unification with Greece. Cyprus has just celebrated the 60th anniversary of its independence. And there's really now a very strong sense of Cyprus identity and statehood that exists, that means that I think if you put this to a vote, you might get 5% of Greek Cypriots who would vote in favour of unification between Cyprus and Greece. Most Cypriots actually are very happy with their statehood, and notwithstanding the difficulties that have gone with it and the division of the island, I think Cyprus has actually been a real success story in many ways. And I know that sounds strange given everything that's, to do with the division. But it has come a long way, and I think there is a real sense now of a Cyprus identity. What needs to be worked on is how to create a Cyprus identity which includes both communities and reunites the island. But I just don't see union with Greece, this idea of enosis, as it was originally called, as something that's realistic anymore. The third question in this group comes from Suki Dervosecha. Do you think that Albania can succeed in making great Albania without creating some major conflicts? This is also a really interesting question because this touches on one of the issues that's really at the heart of the Western Balkans and the issues that we've seen there, which is this idea of creating greater ethnically homogenous national states in the region. And it's extremely difficult. When you start to look at the map, you realise that, different ethnic communities are separated out across the region. So, for example, all right, you've got Albania, but you've also then got Kosovo, which is over 90% Albanian, but also you've then got large Albanian communities. So, for example, in North Macedonia, you have an Albanian community in South Serbia. You also have an Albanian community in the southern part of Montenegro. And so creating a greater Albania naturally throws open very, very significant questions about redrawing borders in the region. And I think the problem is if you start to talk about that for Albania, then you open that question up for Serbia. And of course, we know that there's Serbian communities not only living in northern Kosovo, but more importantly, in many ways, you have the large Serbian community in Bosnia. And obviously, people are very worried about that. So talk about creating greater Serbia, greater Albania, naturally creates a lot of nervousness in the region. And so it obviously has to be managed very, very carefully. There are these national aspirations that I spoke about at the start of the video, but also recognising that you need to have regional and international stability. And in actual fact, the Balkans is a really, really good example of where these ideas really do come into conflict with each other and present real challenges for policymakers. The next question comes from Pascual Gomez. Do you think the Outer Space Treaty will not be that important if the US or China ever tried to colonise space in the far future? This is so interesting, and I think it raises so many key questions. I don't think this is going to be an issue in any of our lifetimes, to be honest with you. But it is something that one could definitely see as becoming a key issue in the future, which will be who owns other planets. Now, I mean, and the moon. And of course, there are discussions about this. We do have treaties that sort of talk about, that it's shared and the rest of it. But I think, we could definitely see real problems emerge on this. And this is something I'd love to look into more. So, yeah, thanks for that question. I'll definitely have a think about doing something on that. Next question, Christian Arnold. If the world had one capital city, what would it be and why? Really, really interesting to think. Could we ever see a world where there is just one single political community and they would have one capital city? Now, depending on which side of debates you sit on, that's either utopian or dystopian. I don't worry necessarily about it, but what would be the capital city? Well, yeah. I think probably one to leave aside without upsetting anyone. But really, really interesting question to think about. So the final question I'll do in this video comes from James Adams. Would you ever expand your channel to anything else? And where do you see your channel going in the future? Now, James, thanks so much for this. This is a really, really interesting question as well. And do you know what? I don't think I'd expand it to look into other particular areas. I think, the questions I'm looking into are ones that I find really interesting. Hopefully you will find really interesting. And there's so many topics to be dealing with. And, I've been really thrilled with the response that I've had from so many people. And, I do say it, I have got a master Excel spreadsheet on my Mac in which I've actually written down all the questions that people have raised. And I will try and get through to doing as many of them as I can. So I think I'd really like to sort of stick into this. But there are some things that I'd like to do. So one of the things that I was thinking prior to COVID lockdown was that if ever I was sort of traveling to places, so for example, I sometimes will go to Nicosia, to Cyprus, to maybe do a walk around video around Nicosia, to show you a little bit about what it's like. It's a country, I lived in Cyprus for many years, and Nicosia in many ways is my second home. And it's so interesting. And for many people who've obviously never been there and don't know what the green line looks like, the dividing line between the communities, I thought it'd be really interesting to do something like that. And I sometimes go to Bosnia as well. So, for example, Banja Luka, for example, would be really interesting, I think, for people. So that was something that I was hoping to do. Another thing I thought would be really interesting is maybe start to do some interviews with various people, maybe policymakers, so diplomats from unrecognized countries. And so these are a few of the things that I like to do with the channel. Do let me know what you think of any of those ideas in the comments below. And if you've got any suggestions, then please do let me know. I love hearing these ideas and seeing what I can do with the channel. I've really enjoyed doing it and working on the channel so far. And so anything extra that I can add into it, I'd certainly be keen to hear about and think about. And where do I see it going in the future? Well, hopefully it'd be nice to see it grow. It's great to think that the word is getting out there, that people who are interested in international relations, and maybe from a slightly different perspective than other channels, I realise that I try and take something where I take sort of, if you like, theories and concepts in international relations, but apply it in a very practical way. I hope that appeals to people, and I know that sometimes it's not quite the sort of thing that you'll see on other channels, but that's exactly why I felt that there was room to do this channel and do it in this way. So obviously I'd like to see it grow. So if you do know anyone who's interested, potentially, for example, people who come from countries that are unrecognized, who might be interested in learning more about the wider international politics, international law situation, around their own case study, but also maybe students studying international relations. If you know of anyone who could be interested, do let them know. So unfortunately, I think that's probably about it for this question and answer. It's gone on slightly longer than I expected, and there were a few questions that I really wanted to get round to tackling, but just wasn't able to. Um, but let me know if you liked it, and perhaps I can do more of these and get round to answering some of these other questions that I didn't tackle this time. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. Do let me know in the comments below what you thought, or if you've got any follow-up on any of the questions. In the meantime, here are some more videos that you might enjoy. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share if you know anyone, again, who might be interested. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thanks a lot. Bye.